The morning of March 3rd in 1943 arrived with crystalline clarity over the waters northeast of New Guinea and aboard the Japanese warship Yukikaze. Naval officers had their binoculars trained on a disturbing sight approaching from the southern horizon. 12 twin-engined aircraft were racing toward their position, flying so impossibly low that the spinning propellers were actually creating visible disturbance patterns across the ocean surface itself. The officers counted and recounted what they were seeing, struggling to comprehend why American bombers would approach a heavily defended convoy at such suicidal altitude. Every piece of conventional military wisdom suggested this was tactical madness. What transpired in the quarter hour that followed would shatter Japanese naval confidence in the Southwest Pacific Theater completely and permanently. Within that brief window of time, 8 transport vessels loaded with nearly 7,000 desperately needed reinforcements would be transformed into burning hulks and sinking wreckage. 4 destroyer escorts that had successfully shepherded convoys across vast ocean distances since the attack on Pearl Harbor would be broken and sent to the bottom. Every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy held regarding air-to-sea combat would descend into the depths of the Bismarck Sea alongside approximately 2,900 Japanese military personnel. The Japanese command structure had no knowledge of what these particular bombers actually represented. These were not standard B-25 Mitchell medium bombers conducting ordinary operations. These aircraft had been radically transformed into flying weapons platforms by an unconventional engineer named Paul Gunn, who everyone called Pappy. Each plane now bristled with 8 forward-pointing 50-caliber machine guns. The engagement about to unfold in the Bismarck Sea would prove conclusively that American innovative thinking had produced something the Japanese military establishment literally could not imagine existing. These were bombers that did not release their ordnance from safe altitude above their targets, but instead skipped those bombs across the water surface like flat stones, while simultaneously unleashing torrents of armor-piercing machine gun fire that could shred metal and flesh with equal efficiency. The convoy that had departed from Rabaul shortly after midnight on the 1st of March in 43 represented the final significant effort to reinforce positions at Leh using surface naval vessels. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army, required these reinforcements with desperate urgency if he hoped to maintain Japanese control over New Guinea, which served as the ultimate defensive barrier protecting the southern approaches to the Japanese Empire itself. The escort force under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura consisted of 8 destroyers, each one a battle-tested veteran of countless Pacific operations. The destroyers, Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo, formed a protective screen around 8 transport ships carrying the precious cargo of men and materials. The transports Ayomaru, Kenbu-maru, Kyokusei-maru, Oigawa-maru, Shinai-maru, Taimei-maru, Teiyo-maru, and the naval auxiliary vessel Nojima were loaded with the entire 51st Division, some 6,900 elite combat troops, along with enough supplies and ammunition to sustain the Leh garrison through months of anticipated fighting. Every detail of the convoy's departure timing had been calculated with meticulous precision. Japanese weather forecasters had predicted 3 solid days of storm coverage, which would provide ideal concealment from American aerial reconnaissance efforts. 100 Zero fighters stationed at various airfields across New Britain and New Guinea stood ready to provide continuous protective air cover throughout the voyage. The planned route hugged close to the northern coastline of New Britain, thereby minimizing the amount of time the convoy would spend exposed in open ocean waters. Captain Tamichi Hara commanded the destroyer Yukikaze and would later write extensively about his experiences in a memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain. In recent weeks, Hara had observed concerning modifications in American tactical approaches. Enemy bombers were attacking from progressively lower altitudes, and their aircraft were being modified in ways that suggested significant changes in combat doctrine. According to accounts written after the war ended, when Hara attempted to voice these concerns to superior officers, he was generally dismissed with assertions that American desperation was driving them to make increasingly reckless tactical errors that would ultimately work to Japan's advantage. What the Japanese leadership could not possibly know was that a genuine revolution in aerial combat methodology had been taking place in workshop facilities at Port Moresby and Townsville throughout the preceding months. Beginning in August of 1942, Major Paul Gunn, formerly a Navy pilot who had transferred to Army Air Forces, had been systematically transforming medium bomber aircraft into something unprecedented in military aviation history. The innovations Gunn developed emerged directly from operational necessity rather than theoretical planning. Traditional high-altitude bombing techniques against naval targets were achieving hit rates below 1%. When bombardiers attempted to strike moving ships from altitudes of 10,000 feet, even the most skilled among them found it nearly impossible to compensate for all the variables involved. Ships could observe bombs falling toward them and had multiple minutes available to execute evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire proved highly effective against aircraft operating at medium bombing altitudes. Something dramatically different was required if American air power hoped to interdict Japanese shipping effectively. Working with salvage components recovered from wrecked fighter aircraft, Gunn installed 4 50-caliber machine guns into the nose sections of B-25 bombers, replacing the standard bombardier's glazed compartment with solid metal construction. He added 4 additional guns mounted in packages positioned below the cockpit area, bringing the total to 8 forward-firing weapons. Each individual gun was capable of firing 850 rounds per minute of armor-piercing ammunition that traveled at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, a single B-25 could project 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated stream of devastating firepower. Major Ed Lana commanded the 90th Bomb Squadron, which was part of the 3rd Bomb Group, and his unit had devoted weeks to perfecting what became known as skip bombing technique. Flying at altitudes of 200 feet or even lower, pilots would release 500-pound bombs equipped with specially configured delay fuses that would cause the weapons to skip across the water surface before slamming into ship hulls below the waterline. The fuses were carefully set to detonate after 4 to 5 seconds, just enough time for the attacking bomber to clear the blast radius of its own weapon. This technique had been practiced repeatedly on the wreck of the SS Pruth, which lay in Port Moresby Harbour and served as a training target until crews could consistently achieve hits with acceptable accuracy. Through extensive trial and experimentation, optimal parameters were established for successful skip bombing attacks. The ideal altitude range was 200 to 250 feet above the water surface. Airspeed should be maintained between 200 and 250 miles per hour. Bombs should be released when the aircraft was positioned 60 to 100 feet from the intended target. The protective storm cover that Japanese meteorologists had predicted for the convoy began breaking apart earlier than forecasted. At 10 in the morning on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator conducting routine reconnaissance operations spotted the convoy through an unexpected gap in the cloud coverage. Within a matter of hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne and heading toward the convoy from their base at Port Moresby. The B-17S conducted their attack from 7,000 feet altitude, which was lower than their typical bombing altitude, but still positioned them above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weaponry. They bracketed the convoy formation with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, the transport vessel Kyokusei Maru absorbed direct hits on her forward cargo compartments. Fires spread rapidly to ammunition storage areas, forcing the ship's crew to abandon vessel. Approximately 900 soldiers were evacuated from the burning transport and transferred to the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These two destroyers, now dangerously overloaded with rescued personnel, raced ahead at maximum speed toward Leh, where they deposited their human cargo before returning to rejoin the convoy formation early on March 3rd. This emergency run successfully saved those particular soldiers, but significantly reduced the convoy's escort strength at an absolutely critical juncture in the operation. What Japanese commanders failed to understand was that the B-17 attack had served as reconnaissance by fire, a deliberate tactic to test defensive capabilities and scatter the convoy formation in preparation for what was planned to follow. Allied operational planners had quite deliberately employed high-altitude bombing first to assess anti-aircraft response and force the convoy to break its protective formation before the main assault commenced. The 3rd of March dawned with disastrous clarity over the Huon Gulf. The convoy had successfully navigated around the Huon Peninsula during night hours and now found itself exposed in open waters, positioned only 80 miles from their destination at Leh. Safety and success seemed tantalizingly within reach. At 5 minutes before 8 in the morning, lookouts stationed aboard the Japanese ships observed the first wave of attacking aircraft approaching from the southern direction. These aircraft were not flying at the 7,000-foot altitude that yesterday's B-17s had maintained. Instead, they were skimming across the wavetops at such minimal altitude that spray kicked up by their propellers was clearly visible to observers. As the attacking aircraft closed to within 2,000 yards, their nose sections erupted with streams of tracer fire. 8 separate lines of bullets from each modified B-25 converged on Japanese anti-aircraft gun positions. Japanese gunners attempting to man their defensive weapons were cut down by the concentrated firepower before they could effectively return fire. Those who managed to take cover found themselves unable to properly defend their vessels while pinned down by the relentless strafing. Following behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own devastating contribution to the assault with 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 machine guns per aircraft. The combined firepower from American and Australian aircraft proved absolutely overwhelming, systematically suppressing anti-aircraft defensive positions across the entire convoy formation. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. Flying in formations of 3 aircraft at 200 feet altitude, they bore down on the convoy at speeds of 250 miles per hour. This represented the culminating moment that months of intensive training had prepared them to execute. The lead bomber released its bomb approximately 300 yards from the transport ship Shinai Maru. The bomb impacted the water surface, skipped twice across the waves, and slammed into the ship's hull just above the waterline with tremendous force. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delay fuse timing was designed to function, the bomb detonated inside the cargo hold, literally ripping the vessel apart from internal explosion. The transport Kenbu Maru, heavily loaded with drums of aviation fuel, absorbed a skip bomb amidships. The resulting explosion ignited her volatile cargo, creating a massive fireball that rose 500 feet into the tropical air. The ship disintegrated in mere seconds, leaving only burning debris scattered across the water surface. The Ayomaru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession from different attacking bombers. Her hull was opened like someone had used a can opener on thin metal. The Oigawa Maru, desperately attempting to maneuver away from the attacking aircraft, took bomb impacts from 2 different B-25s simultaneously. Her back was broken by the explosions, causing the vessel to jackknife in the middle and sink within a matter of minutes. The destroyer Asashio, under the command of Captain Yasuo Sato, attempted to position herself between the attacking bombers and the vulnerable transport ships. She was immediately bracketed by 3 B-25s executing coordinated attacks. Skip bombs slammed into her engine room compartments, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept across her deck spaces, killing virtually everyone exposed above deck. Dead in the water and burning from multiple fires, she became a stationary target for subsequent attack waves that followed. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Lana's squadron had released their first bombs, 7 of the 8 transport vessels were either already sunk or in the process of sinking. 3 destroyers, specifically the Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, had sustained mortal damage and would not survive. The Shirayuki would eventually sink later in the day. The convoy had completely ceased to exist as any kind of organized fighting force. The destruction of the vessels themselves represented only the beginning of an unfolding tragedy. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom had never learned to swim properly, were thrown into the oil-covered waters of the Huon Gulf without warning or preparation. Those soldiers who possessed swimming ability faced a horrible choice between attempting to reach the New Guinea coastline through shark-infested waters with dangerous currents, or clinging to floating debris while hoping desperately for rescue that might never arrive. The destroyer Shikinami, one of the few escort vessels still capable of operating, began pulling survivors from the water as quickly as possible. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard as fast as their strength allowed. They managed to save approximately 300 men in the first hour of rescue operations. Then American aircraft returned for follow-up attacks. The subsequent attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts carrying survivors. Machine gun bullets churned the sea surface into foam. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. PT boats also participated in operations to prevent Japanese survivors from successfully reaching shore, following explicit orders to ensure enemy soldiers could not reinforce the garrison at Leh. For Japanese military observers who managed to survive the engagement, the attack revealed devastating truths about American capabilities. The skip bombing technique, which had been developed and perfected in just a few months of intensive experimentation, had no corresponding counter-tactic anywhere in Japanese military doctrine. Ships could not depress their anti-aircraft gun barrels sufficiently to engage aircraft flying at mast height. Torpedoes could not be aimed at aircraft targets. Traditional anti-aircraft defensive doctrine proved completely useless against this new form of attack. The firepower carried by the B-25s proved particularly shocking to Japanese observers. Standard Japanese fighters typically carried 2 7.7mm machine guns, occasionally supplemented by 20mm cannons for additional punch. These American bombers carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, representing the combined firepower of multiple fighter aircraft, all aimed in a single direction, all controlled by one trigger under the pilot's finger. Even more disturbing than the raw firepower was the level of coordination displayed throughout the engagement. The attack involved American B-17, B-25s, A-20 from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Beaufighters, representing over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, and even different nations, all working in absolutely perfect synchronization. They communicated constantly throughout the battle, adjusting tactics in real time based on radio reports being transmitted between aircraft. As darkness fell across the battle site on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to search desperately for survivors among the floating wreckage. They discovered a sea covered with debris and corpses. Oil fires continued burning on portions of the water surface. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng, carrying additional fuel, which allowed rescue operations to continue throughout the night hours. In total, approximately 2,700 men were eventually pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200 personnel, including those who had been landed at Leh before the main attack occurred, eventually made it to their destination. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing New Guinea positions, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force before firing a single shot at enemy forces. All of the ammunition, food supplies, medical equipment, and other materials needed to sustain military operations for months had gone down with the sunken transports. The aviation fuel loaded aboard the Kenbu Maru, which was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying operational missions, was now nothing more than a spreading slick on the Bismarck Sea surface. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the detailed battle report while in his cabin aboard the massive battleship Musashi, which was anchored at Truk. According to staff officers who were present at the time, Yamamoto sat in complete silence for an extended period before speaking any words in response. The strategic implications were unmistakably clear to everyone present. Japan could no longer successfully reinforce forward garrison positions using surface convoy operations within range of Allied aircraft. The supply lifeline to forward bases had been severed completely. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented far more than a simple tactical defeat in a single engagement. It marked a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare being conducted across the Pacific theater. Never again would Japanese forces attempt to reinforce their garrison positions using surface convoy operations within effective range of Allied aircraft. The strategic implications rippled outward through every level of Japanese operational planning. General Imamura personally flew to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report directly to the highest levels of command. In a meeting that lasted 6 full hours, he presented comprehensive evidence demonstrating that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese to effectively counter it. The Americans were not simply building greater numbers of aircraft. They were fundamentally revolutionizing how aircraft fought and what aircraft could accomplish. On March 25 in 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area operations officially gave operations in New Guinea priority over those being conducted in the Solomon Islands. However, without the capability to reinforce positions by sea, this represented an essentially empty gesture. Japanese forces already deployed in New Guinea would be required to fight without any realistic hope of receiving significant reinforcement or resupply from outside sources. For American forces, the victory validated 2 full years of innovation, adaptation, and systematic improvement. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had successfully transformed his organization from a traditional bombing unit into something genuinely unprecedented in military history, an aerial navy capable of controlling sea lanes without requiring any actual ships. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the devastating skip-bombing attack, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his exceptional leadership during the engagement. The official citation praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that destroyed the convoy so comprehensively. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later, on April 30th in 1943, when his B-25 crashed during landing approach at Dobodura airfield. He had survived 87 combat missions only to die in what should have been a routine landing accident. North American Aviation Company immediately began incorporating Gunn's field modifications into standard factory production processes. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower, including even a 75mm cannon, though the cannon ultimately proved less practically useful than multiple machine guns in actual combat conditions. The B-25H model would eventually carry 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns total, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft in the entire war. Beyond the strategic and tactical implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy on a massive scale. The 2,890 Japanese who died were not mere statistics in some military ledger. They were individual sons, fathers, husbands, brothers. Many had been conscripted from civilian occupations as farmers, clerks, students, people who barely understood the war they had been drafted to fight. The American pilots who conducted the mission understood the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore to reinforce garrison positions. But this understanding did not make the actions any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew members reported experiencing nightmares about the strafing missions for many years afterward. The demonstrated success at Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across all theaters. Within a matter of months, new techniques were being developed and implemented rapidly. Parafrags, which were parachute-equipped fragmentation bombs designed for attacking airfields, allowed low-level bombing without the attacking aircraft being damaged by its own bomb explosions. White phosphorus bombs for marking targets clearly. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms. Each innovation built upon the foundation of overwhelming industrial capacity. Americans could afford to experiment freely because failure cost only material resources, and material was essentially unlimited from American production. Japanese innovation efforts increasingly stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources that could not be easily replaced. By stark contrast, Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual solutions rather than material or technical solutions to military problems. The kamikaze concept, which involved using pilots as essentially guided missiles, emerged partly from recognizing that Japan could not match American technology or production capacity. If they could not outbuild or out-innovate the Americans through conventional means, they would attempt to outdie them through sacrifice. Crucial to the victory at Bismarck Sea was American code-breaking capability. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and naval intelligence organizations in Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese communications messages, revealing the convoy's exact schedule, planned route, and composition. General Kenny knew precisely when and where to position his forces for maximum devastating effect. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected to prevent Japanese forces from realizing their codes had been compromised. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to appear to discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the fiction that standard patrol procedures rather than signals intelligence had provided the advance warning. The deception proved so successful that Japanese forces never realized their communication codes were being read routinely, and they continued using the same encryption systems throughout the remainder of the war. The Royal Australian Air Force's role in the battle demonstrated the superiority of Allied coordination and cooperation. RAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on identical frequencies, following the same tactical procedures. Squadron leader serving with the RAAF flew 3 separate sorties during the battle engagement. He would later receive the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions in subsequent operations, before being captured and executed by Japanese forces. The seamless integration of Australian and American forces stood in stark contrast to Japanese operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively with each other, often competing for scarce resources rather than cooperating toward common objectives. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredibly complex supply chain stretching back thousands of miles to American factory facilities. Each individual B-25 required 165,000 separate parts, manufactured in dozens of different states across America. The .50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in manufacturing plants scattered from Connecticut to California, with billions of rounds manufactured during the war years. The skip bombing technique required special delayed action fuses manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants spread across the country. The aviation fuel for training flights came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship transport from the United States mainland. This entire supply chain operated smoothly, while America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with materials, and maintaining forces scattered across the vast Pacific theater. The Japanese convoy destroyed at Bismarck Sea represented Japan's absolute maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea positions. The forces that destroyed it constituted a tiny fraction of total American production capability. The American pilots who devastated the convoy had averaged 400 flight hours of training before entering combat operations. They had practiced skip bombing techniques for weeks, using virtually unlimited quantities of fuel and ammunition for training purposes. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before the actual mission. By sharp contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 increasingly did so with less than 100 hours total flight time. Fuel shortages meant minimal training opportunities. The veteran pilots who might have provided instruction to newcomers were mostly dead, killed by the brutal mathematics of American industrial production. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students being thrown into combat against experienced American aviators who had survived dozens of missions. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces deployed in New Guinea found themselves strategically isolated from outside support. Supplies could only be delivered by submarine, which was extremely dangerous and severely limited in cargo capacity. Fast destroyer runs conducted at night represented another option, equally hazardous and insufficient for sustaining major military operations. These so-called Tokyo Express runs could deliver only a tiny fraction of what the destroyed convoy had carried in its holds. Japanese commanders turned to using barges, attempting to creep along coastal areas at night with supply loads. These became priority targets for PT boats and modified B-25s equipped with radar systems for night hunting operations. By June of 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea were subsisting on half rations. By September, they were eating grass, tree bark, roots, anything remotely edible. The army that had conquered Singapore with seemingly unstoppable momentum was literally starving to death in the jungle, defeated not primarily by bullets, but by interdiction, the systematic cutting of supply lines through overwhelming air power. For Japanese military culture, which was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, emphasizing personal combat prowess and individual heroism, the industrialized slaughter at Bismarck Sea represented something incomprehensible. Ships destroyed by aircraft they could not effectively engage. Soldiers killed by bombs skipped across water. Victory achieved through industrial production rather than warrior spirit. Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics throughout the remainder of the war. Banzai charges, kamikaze attacks, seeking meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing they could not overcome through traditional means. Americans would respond with ever more firepower, more technology, more industrial solutions to military problems. The gap between traditional warrior culture and industrial warfare would only continue widening. Pappy Gunn had installed cameras in the tail sections of modified B-25s, activated automatically when bombs were released from the aircraft. These cameras captured the destruction of the convoy in devastating photographic detail. Ships exploding, capsizing, burning, sinking. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effects and served multiple important purposes simultaneously. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify pilot claims of ships destroyed with photographic evidence. They became invaluable training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing worked under actual combat conditions. They served as powerful propaganda tools, demonstrating American military power to allies and enemies alike. The Japanese possessed no equivalent photographic capability, relying instead on pilot reporting, which was often inaccurate in the confusion and heat of actual combat conditions. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the incredibly harsh environmental conditions of New Guinea. Tropical heat, humidity that bred corrosion on metal surfaces, coral dust that abraded engines and mechanical components. Yet mechanical failures during the actual mission were remarkably rare. American engines were deliberately over-engineered, built with power reserves that allowed them to continue functioning even when not perfectly maintained. Japanese aircraft by 1943 were increasingly being grounded for extended periods due to lack of spare parts, while American aircraft flew daily missions with remarkable reliability. During the battle engagement, American and Australian aircraft communicated constantly via radio transmissions. Pilots reported target locations to each other, warned of fighter attacks, coordinated approaches to maximize effectiveness. This real-time information sharing multiplied combat effectiveness exponentially, allowing aircraft to support each other and exploit tactical opportunities as they emerged during the fluid combat situation. Japanese communications were minimal and often completely non-functional. Radio equipment proved unreliable under combat conditions. Frequencies were not standardized between different military services. Radio discipline was generally poor. Ships and aircraft often fought in complete isolation, unable to coordinate effectively or warn each other of emerging threats. American pilots flew into battle knowing that if they were shot down and wounded, they possessed excellent chances of survival and recovery. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin were standard items in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by aircraft was routine procedure, with wounded pilots often arriving in hospital facilities within hours of being shot down and rescued. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short, even before the convoy's destruction. The medicines that might have saved wounded lives were now resting at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge fundamentally affected morale. American pilots flew with confidence in their equipment and support systems, while Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were expendable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it absolutely could not afford to lose under any circumstances. The 8 transport vessels represented many months of production from Japanese shipyards already strained far beyond sustainable capacity. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of total Japanese production that could not possibly be replaced quickly. For America, the battle was economically insignificant in the larger picture. The ammunition expended was replaced within days from massive stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from reserves. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943, nearly 300 per day on average. The fuel burned in training exercises and combat operations was essentially a rounding error in total American petroleum production capacity. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reverberated through the remainder of the entire Pacific War. It proved conclusively that air power could control sea lanes effectively without requiring naval vessels. It demonstrated that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces deployed across the Southwest Pacific, it marked the beginning of the end of any realistic hope. Cut off from reinforcement and resupply, they would fight a series of increasingly desperate holding actions, each ending in either annihilation or slow starvation. The island-hopping strategy became genuinely viable because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed completely, left to wither without supplies, while American forces advanced toward Japan itself. The success at Bismarck Sea dramatically accelerated B-25 development programs. The B-25G model, entering active service in late 1943, carried a massive 75mm cannon, the largest weapon ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber aircraft. Though the cannon ultimately proved less practically useful than multiple machine guns in actual combat, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment boldly with unconventional weapons. Each design iteration reflected lessons learned from combat and the industrial capability to implement changes rapidly. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese strategic confidence at the highest levels. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet emphasized American material superiority rather than tactical or operational superiority, representing a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes primarily to luck or Japanese tactical mistakes. One captured intelligence report stated explicitly that the enemy's production capacity allowed them to implement new tactical innovations faster than effective counters could be developed and deployed. This recognition of fundamental industrial disadvantage marked a dramatic shift in Japanese strategic thinking at command levels. After Bismarck Sea, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of overall Japanese strategy in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The conclusions reached were deeply sobering for anyone who read them honestly. Surface reinforcement of forward-based positions was no longer operationally possible. American air power had achieved operational supremacy that could not be contested. The industrial gap was widening progressively, not narrowing. Traditional naval superiority had become strategically irrelevant if ships could not survive concentrated air attack. The formal recommendation was to abandon offensive operations entirely and prepare for defense of the inner perimeter territories. However, even this defensive strategy rested on assumptions that American attacks would come at a pace Japan could potentially match, an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic as American industrial production continued accelerating. The skip bombing technique pioneered at Bismarck Sea spread rapidly throughout American forces across multiple theaters. Navy PBY Catalina flying boats adopted it for night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots employed it effectively in the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots received training in the technique in case they unexpectedly encountered enemy shipping while flying supply missions. This rapid proliferation was possible because America had genuinely standardized training procedures, equipment, and communications across all services. A technique developed and perfected in New Guinea could be successfully implemented in operations in the Aleutians within a matter of weeks. Japanese forces, divided by intense service rivalries and poor communication between branches, rarely shared tactical innovations even within the same geographic theater. The statistical numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory operationally possible. During World War II, American factories produced 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers in total. Ammunition manufacturing plants produced 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight training schools graduated 193,440 pilots. Every single B-25 component part was stockpiled in multiple locations scattered across the Pacific Theater. Against this industrial tsunami of production, Japanese military courage and fighting spirit were ultimately irrelevant factors. The bravest samurai warrior could not overcome the cold mathematics of mass industrial production. Pappy-Gunn's camera installations provided absolutely unprecedented documentation of combat effectiveness with scientific precision. The footage, when studied frame by analysts, revealed optimal tactical parameters with remarkable clarity. Bomb release should occur at 200 to 250 feet altitude. Approach speed should be maintained at 245 miles per hour. Release distance should be 60 to 100 feet from target for maximum effectiveness against shipping. This thoroughly scientific approach to warfare, measuring variables, analyzing results, optimizing procedures, was quintessentially American in character. War had become fundamentally an engineering problem with industrial solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit or martial prowess. The loss of supplies at Bismarck Sea created an immediate and severe crisis for Japanese forces deployed throughout New Guinea. Within a matter of weeks, frontline combat units were reporting critical shortages across all categories. Ammunition was strictly restricted to 10 rounds per day per individual soldier. Rice rations were reduced to 400 grams daily per man. Medical supplies had been completely exhausted with no replacements available. Fuel for vehicles was unavailable for any purpose. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of spare parts. American forces deployed in the same geographic area, by stark contrast, complained if ice cream was not available daily in their mess facilities. The economic disparity between the two nations was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often refused to believe American supply levels were actually real, assuming they were being shown elaborate propaganda designed to break their morale. Success at Bismarck Sea accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare across all categories. Within months of the battle, new developments were being tested and implemented. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms, napalm incendiary weapons for attacking Japanese positions in jungle terrain, rocket-assisted bombs for increased penetration of hardened targets, white phosphorus marker rounds for target identification by follow-up waves. Each innovation built directly upon industrial capacity to experiment freely and implement successful changes rapidly through mass production. Americans could afford failed experiments because failures cost only material resources that could be easily replaced. Japanese innovation efforts stagnated progressively because every single experiment consumed absolutely irreplaceable resources. Behind every B-25 that participated in attacks at Bismarck Sea stood a maintenance crew that kept aircraft flying under incredibly difficult conditions. These men, working in primitive facilities scattered across New Guinea, performed daily mechanical miracles that kept aircraft operational. Engines were overhauled in jungle workshops using improvised tools. Battle damage was repaired using salvaged materials from wrecked aircraft. Field modifications were implemented using nothing but hand tools and ingenuity. Aircraft were completely turned around between missions in just hours when necessary. This maintenance capability reflected America's broad industrial training base. Hundreds of thousands of Americans possessed practical knowledge of how to repair engines, fix electrical systems, and work metal. This vast pool of distributed technical expertise represented perhaps America's single greatest military advantage. The controversial strafing of survivors in the water, which remained controversial even among Americans who participated, served a harsh but calculated military purpose. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theater learned through bitter experience that attempting to reach shore after their transport ships were sunk meant almost certain death from air attack. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate battle, profoundly affecting Japanese morale in future naval engagements. General Douglas MacArthur publicly called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. His official communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses, but the fundamental strategic impact fully justified his obvious enthusiasm about the results. Air power had conclusively proven it could interdict sea lanes just as effectively as submarines or surface naval vessels. Admiral Yamamoto, carefully reading the detailed battle reports, made what would prove a fateful personal decision. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been shattered by the defeat. This decision, driven by depression following Bismarck Sea, would lead directly to his death on April 18th in 1943. When American codebreakers learned of his travel itinerary and P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville, shooting him down and killing him. American forces institutionalized the tactical lessons of Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within mere weeks of the battle, training manuals were being updated with skip bombing techniques. New pilots were practicing low-level attacks at training bases. Tactical doctrine was being systematically revised to place greater emphasis on anti-shipping operations. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center conducted exhaustive analysis of every aspect of the battle, producing detailed analytical reports that were distributed throughout the Pacific Theater. Japanese institutional learning was severely hampered by deep systemic problems throughout the military structure. Intense service rivalries prevented honest analysis of what had actually occurred. Army and Navy branches blamed each other rather than examining fundamental weaknesses in doctrine or capability. Face-saving cultural concerns obscured recognition of failures. By the time Japanese forces finally developed partial tactical counters to skip bombing techniques, American innovation had already moved forward to entirely new tactics. The B-25 modifications that had proved so devastatingly successful went into mass production with remarkable speed. North American Aviation's factory facilities in Kansas City and Inglewood retooled their production lines within a matter of weeks. By late 1943, new B-25s were coming directly from the factory floor with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment, reinforced nose structure specifically designed for gun installation, upgraded engines optimized for low-level performance characteristics, improved armor protection for crew members, and built-in camera installations for battle damage documentation. This rapid transition from field modification to standardized mass production perfectly exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan simply could never hope to match. After Bismarck Sea, American bomber crew training programs incorporated low-level attack techniques as completely standard curriculum at all training facilities. Pilots practiced skip bombing at training bases scattered across Texas and Arizona using target ships positioned in the Gulf of Mexico and California's Salton Sea. This training was extraordinarily fuel-intensive by any standard. Each individual pilot consumed thousands of gallons of aviation fuel simply learning the technique through repetitive practice. But America could easily afford this expenditure. By 1943, American refineries were producing 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan desperately struggled to import enough fuel to keep its operational fleet running at all. Several B-25s returned from Bismarck Sea, carrying significant battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Holes from shell fragments, damaged control surfaces, shot-up engines. Within 72 hours, every single damaged aircraft was flying operational missions again, repaired using aluminum patches fabricated in field workshops, engines replaced using improvised lifting equipment, control cables spliced together with salvaged materials, fuel tanks patched with rubber recovered from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft sustaining similar levels of damage would have been immediately written off as total losses, cannibalized for spare parts if anything remained salvageable. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing operationally possible represented marvels of precision engineering, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. They had to survive the tremendous impact of hitting water at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Function reliably after multiple skips across wave surfaces, detonate at precisely the correct moment to maximize damage. American factories produced these precision fuses by the millions, with each individual unit tested and certified before shipment. Japanese fuses, by sharp comparison, had failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943 due to quality control problems and chronic material shortages. American aircraft located the Japanese convoy precisely when and where expected, despite challenging weather conditions and vast distances involved. This reflected clear superiority in multiple areas of navigation training. American pilots averaged 400 hours of flight time before entering combat operations. Navigation equipment included accurate compasses and reliable instruments. Map quality was excellent, based on detailed charts from comprehensive pre-war surveys. Weather forecasting provided meteorological support that had accurately predicted the clearing weather. Japanese navigation increasingly relied on simply following lead aircraft or using coastal landmarks for reference, which severely limited operational flexibility. American intelligence services had known about the convoy well in advance through successful code-breaking operations, but this secret had to be carefully protected. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to appear to discover the convoy through routine visual observation, maintaining the essential fiction that standard patrol procedures, rather than signals intelligence, had provided advance warning. The deception proved so completely successful that Japanese forces never realized their communication codes were being routinely read by American cryptographers, and they continued using identical encryption systems that Americans could decrypt easily. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh discovered a garrison already subsisting on severely reduced rations. The supplies that were supposed to sustain operations for months had been destroyed at sea. Within a matter of weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for anything edible in the surrounding jungle. Disease became epidemic throughout the garrison. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, malnutrition progressively decimated units. By June of 1943, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces deployed at Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone, without significant combat action. American pilots flying at Bismarck Sea were operating under limited combat tour policies, typically 50 missions or 6 months of combat duty, before rotating home to train new pilots and share combat experience. This systematic approach preserved hard-won expertise and disseminated tactical lessons throughout the entire force structure. Veterans became instructors at training facilities, passing combat techniques to the next generation of pilots entering the war. Japanese pilots flew continuous combat operations until they were killed. The expertise gained at terrible cost over months or years was lost forever when experienced pilots died. By late 1943, most genuinely experienced Japanese pilots were dead, and their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices, being sent into combat against American veterans who had survived dozens of missions. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a remarkable convergence of multiple American technological advantages operating simultaneously. industrial capacity to actually produce modified aircraft in quantity. Innovation culture that encouraged and rewarded field modifications, training resources for perfecting entirely new tactical approaches, intelligence capability to locate targets with precision, communication systems enabling coordination of complex multi-unit attacks, supply chains capable of sustaining extended operations far from home bases. No single advantage proved decisive by itself. Their combination proved absolutely overwhelming to Japanese forces. The Japanese faced not merely superior numbers, but superior integrated systems, industrial, organizational, and technological, that they possessed no capability to match or counter. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only 3 calendar days, with the absolutely decisive action occurring in just 15 minutes on the morning of March 3rd in 1943. In those 15 brief minutes, the fundamental nature of warfare being conducted in the Pacific Theater changed forever and irreversibly. Air power had proven conclusively that it could control vital sea lanes without requiring any naval vessels whatsoever. Industrial innovation had demonstrated it could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could possibly develop effective counters. American production had shown that sheer quantity, when properly applied with sound tactics, possessed a quality all its own. For the Japanese military, Bismarck Sea represented far more than a simple tactical defeat in one engagement. It constituted definitive proof that their entire philosophical approach to modern warfare had become completely obsolete. Courage, warrior spirit, martial tradition, none of these meant anything substantial against modified B-25s carrying 8 machine guns and skip bombs. They were fighting a war against machines and integrated industrial systems they simply could not match regardless of sacrifice or determination. For American forces, Bismarck Sea validated years of systematic preparation and continuous innovation. Pappy guns, field modifications, originally developed with salvage parts and simple hand tools in primitive jungle workshops, had proven more operationally effective than any purpose-built weapon system. The marriage of characteristically American ingenuity with overwhelming industrial capacity had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japan possessed absolutely no capability to counter effectively. The battle's strategic legacy extended far beyond the immediate Southwest Pacific theater of operations. It demonstrated definitively that in modern industrialized warfare, industrial production capacity was fundamentally equivalent to military capacity itself. The nation that could build the most equipment, train the most personnel, innovate the fastest, and adapt most quickly to changing conditions would ultimately prevail in extended conflict. Traditional military virtues like courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice remained genuinely important, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to guarantee victory. In 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bomber aircraft accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy could not prevent despite their best efforts. They systematically cut Japan's supply lines and doomed Japanese forces in New Guinea to eventual starvation and inevitable defeat. Those 15 minutes marked the precise moment when industrial warfare definitively replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who witnessed the attack and could not believe what they were seeing were absolutely right to feel incredulous. They were witnessing something that should not have been possible according to everything they understood about naval warfare doctrine. But American industrial innovation had transformed the impossible into routine procedure, the previously unthinkable into standard operating practice. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands throughout history as definitive proof that in modern warfare, the nation with superior factories defeats the nation with braver soldiers. It remains a lesson written in flame and destruction across the waters of the Huon Gulf, a lesson that would define the remainder of the Pacific War completely. In the age of industrial warfare, production capacity equals power, innovation equals strategy, and the assembly line proves ultimately mightier than any sword. The Japanese officers could not believe it when modified B-25 bombers destroyed 8 transport ships in just 15 minutes of coordinated attack. By the time they fully accepted this new reality, it was already far too late to matter. The war had been lost, not in those 15 minutes of visible destruction, but in the preceding years of industrial preparation and systematic innovation that made those 15 minutes operationally possible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea simply represented the moment when that long-prepared victory became undeniably visible to everyone who witnessed it unfold.